Good evening. I just want you to know that we didn't plan this. I did not know what Dr. Bullock was presenting, but it is perfect introduction for the next piece on social studies curriculum. And I think that what Ms. Reagan shared with you tonight is the exact example of what teaching and learning looks like in public school right now. It is no longer a matter of students sitting in chairs and receiving information from teachers. It's all about students having agency in their learning and teachers being the facilitator, tapping into students' interests and students' potential for doing research, reading, writing, and integrating to actually then engage in project-based learning. So this was a perfect introduction to this next segment. I'm actually here this evening because I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce you formally to Dr. Rachel Strang. Due to COVID, she has not come to the board recently, but she is the social studies curriculum supervisor for K through 12 in Talbot County Public Schools. I will throw this plug in, however, we all know that every person who is a supervisor in this county does have more responsibility than just one area. So Dr. Strang is also responsible for overseeing all of our Title II grant and managing that and all the pieces that go with that. She also facilitates professional learning in the county for pre-K through 12, which is a very large task. She also is in charge of our financial literacy, which we know is important for our students, and also serves as our liaison with junior achievement. So again, just making everyone aware of how much our supervisors in Talbot County Public Schools do. In 2015, the national standards for social studies were updated into the C3 framework, which really embraced the inquiry process and model for learning in the classroom, which Dr. Strang is going to share with you and that you've actually just seen on the screen tonight. Maryland followed suit shortly after that in revising their state framework to align with the C3 standards and to incorporate fully a focus on inquiry learning in social studies. So this is part of our state mandate that we look at what we're doing in the county and that we update our resources to provide our teachers with what they need to engage students in learning like you saw this evening. We know in Talbot County that our budget is always an issue and we are always having to make choices about what we do. And with all the changes in public education and our standards, we've had to methodically do updates over the years. So it is now time for social studies. So I am at this point going to turn it over to Dr. Strang. You will remember her in her previous role as a literacy coach through a grant-funded position, but she is a former social studies teacher at both St. Michael's and Easton High School, and she is a graduate of Talbot County Public Schools. So Dr. Strang.
Yay! Welcome, Dr. Strang. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening, board members and Dr. Griffith. Dr. Einhorn said very much the same thing that I was going to say, that we did not plan this. This was not intentional, but when I was listening to Dr. Bullock and Mrs. Reagan explain that unit, that's exactly a great example of what we're going to be talking about tonight as something that would happen in our social studies curriculum. It really is inquiry-based instruction at its true heart. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of that curriculum, but before we do that, I just wanted to talk you through the process of how we selected this curriculum. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Go ahead, you can go ahead.
I gotcha.
Yep. So this process started back in the fall. In October, we were looking at different curriculum that was available, and we narrowed it down to two of the options that seemed to be most aligned to both the standards and were truly inquiry-based instruction. So out of those two options, we formed a review team, and that review team consisted of both primary teachers, upper elementary teachers, as well as administrators. So we wanted to make sure that we had a good representation of all of the grade bands that it would be serving. So that committee came together and they had the presentation from both of the vendors that we were looking at, and then they took the curriculum, really dug deep into it to try to look at the resources, and they had a focus while they were looking at those resources, and that's what you'll see displayed here. So the number one thing that we were really looking at is it standards-based, and is the content aligned with our state frameworks that have been recently updated? And we also really wanted to make sure that it was inquiry-based instruction as well, because that is part of our standards. We also wanted to see what the differences were and which were the best in terms of teacher materials and the support that teachers would be provided in implementation, what student materials and support would be provided for all different types of learning styles, for EL supports that they might have. And then we also looked at assessments, compared costs, and do we have access to ongoing updates, or is it like a textbook where you get the textbook and then you have to buy an updated copy later? And then we also looked at the training piece as well. So that curriculum review team came back together and unanimously decided on inquiry journeys to pilot in the spring. It really wasn't even close when we were looking at the two that we were comparing. It really seemed that the other vendor that was not inquiry journeys had called itself inquiry, but was just really not inquiry. It seemed like a textbook that had been revised with the inquiry title put on it, whereas inquiry journeys has been created with inquiry at the forefront the entire time. So in the spring, the grades 3 through 5 have piloted that and have had a lot of success. We've gotten a lot of really great feedback. The engagement, my teachers going from what they had in the fall to this, they said that the kids were so much more engaged. Even some of our virtual students started coming more on Wednesdays during the optional time to participate in some of the asynchronous opportunities on Wednesdays, or the synchronous opportunities on Wednesdays. So I'm going to give you an overview or a snapshot of one of our first grade units, and then I'm going to talk to you about what inquiry instruction really is. So one of the pieces at the heart of inquiry instruction is that they all start with a compelling question. Every unit has a compelling question. So in this first grade unit, the compelling question is, how can we bring families together to form a stronger community? And in this particular unit, the unit vocab words, remember this is first grade, so the unit vocab words would have been something that would have been talked about in this previous lesson. And then at the start of every single unit, K through 6, they always do something called the question formulation technique. So we're going to talk through what that is, and this is one of the strengths of the Inquiry Journeys platform, because this is what truly makes it inquiry and student-centered, and exactly what Dr. Bullock was showing you guys earlier. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And the rules for the question formulation technique are very intentional. So the first rule is to generate as many questions as possible. So students would be given a time limit depending on the question and how much time in class, they might have. The goal is just to generate as many questions as possible. And we don't want to make any judgments. We don't even want to say things like, oh, great question, I had that question too, because it slows down that process, and we just want to get them thinking as quickly as we can and come up with as many questions as they can. The goal is also to write down every question exactly as it was stated. So if you had a recorder, you don't want to interpret somebody's question differently. You want it to be their voice as they create the questions, and then change any statements to questions. That's okay. Sorry. Change any statements to questions. And this one's a really important one too, because there are lots of times if we have been introduced to that question, we might think, oh, I know the answer to that. So we want to turn that back into a question and see if that is something that is going to be confirmed, or maybe we're going to be rethinking that answer a little bit. So turning our statements into questions if somebody comes up with a statement. So if you could actually click on that underlined text, it's going to take us to a Jamboard, and I hope this works. Sorry, I was not thinking that somebody else would have to manage this piece.
It's on my screen. I don't know why it's not on your screen.
So the Jamboard that comes up when you click this link, and you guys actually do have access to this in the PowerPoint, you would be able to click on this text if you want to see the piece that I'm talking about. In the question formulation technique, there's always a statement. It's not a question because the kids are coming up with the questions. So our statement for this first grade unit is, let's bring families together to make our community stronger. Remember, this is first grade. So they are naturally curious. I remember lots, and I've come across myself as a first grader, I've come across a lot of other first graders, and you always hear, why, and it just seems to be never ending. But you kind of talk them through how to craft a question, and that's part of the process, is helping the kids to craft good questions. So that's why you see these words, just to help students with that process for asking questions. So again, the goal is really to just come up with as many questions as possible. And what I've shown you guys here is just some examples of questions that first graders might come up with. So who is in a family? Who's in a community? What do people in a community do together? So these are all questions that first graders might come up with. And then the goal is that they're going to be able to get to answer these questions as they learn throughout the unit. And this is what really makes it inquiry and student-centered, because the students are getting to select what they're learning. They have these questions, and then the teacher's going to be able to refer back to these as they learn in a more structured inquiry environment. So this is just an example, and like I said, this process that we're walking through is something that really, it fosters a lot of collaboration because they do this in small groups. It also fosters a lot of critical thinking skills, so thinking about how to create questions, what questions do they have, and then how are you going to find those answers. Next steps for question formulation technique, I'm not going to walk you through the sample of that, but students take these questions and they either make them stronger. And being first grade, there's probably going to be some questions that they would come up with that are not relevant to this topic at all. So that would be where the teacher would have the opportunity to say, let's think about this. Does this question relate to what we're going to be learning about? And they might have the opportunity to answer the question still, but they can fine-tune those questions a little bit better. So now we're going to break down what inquiry instruction truly is. So like I said, it starts with a compelling question. And one of the things that you'll notice about compelling questions is that there's not one right answer. So the question that we looked at was, how do we bring families together to make our community stronger? There's not one way to do that. There's not one right answer for that. So that's our compelling question for the unit. It also is really important for that compelling question to spark the curiosity and student learning as an engagement factor, which is exactly what happened with Dr. Bullock's class. That is actually an inquiry unit that New York uses. They have a state food now as yogurt, and it ends up, it's part of their process. So it goes exactly through that same process, and the students, you can see that engagement increases. This inquiry is a little bit more structured because we do have content that we have to incorporate and make sure that students are learning. So it moves through a rigorous investigation that is not quite as teacher-centered. It's not about filling in worksheets. You're not reading and then finding the answers. You're not getting a lecture and then finding the answers. You're moving through a rigorous investigation to try to find answers to your question. And then the finishing module in each unit is ending in an argument or an action. And a perfect example of that was what you guys saw with St. Michael's Elementary School. Their informed action that they took was writing a letter to petition. That's something that students would do in this curriculum, is trying to go learn the processes of how do you make change happen. In the unit that we looked at for first grade, their taking informed action was to create a periodical or write a periodical. So it could be a newspaper article, it could be a newsletter that they wanted to send out, that this is how we need to bring our community together to make people strong, make our community stronger. So I just wanted to bring this up to kind of show you what it may have looked like in the past versus what Inquiry Journeys looks like. So if you look on this left-hand side over here, a unit that's structured by content, we have the American Revolution up here as a concept. So before, we might have had a lecture or watched a video or read something out of a textbook about the causes of the revolution, the course of the war, important battles or revolutionary figures. We would have talked about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but this is very teacher-centered. This is the teacher delivering all of the information to the student, and then the student typically is giving that information back to the teacher in the form of a quiz or a worksheet or something. And that relevancy piece and engagement factor is a lot harder in this style. This is the same content, it's just reframed into a question. So if you look at the comparison of the ones on this left-hand side, what sparks a revolution? We're still learning about the causes of the revolution. What contributes to success? So they are still going to learn about the battles and which battle, why was this side successful in this battle? What advantages might they have had? So the content piece is still there. It's just focusing more on the process and answering questions. And on the right-hand side, this is a snapshot from our Maryland framework for the content that is about the American Revolution. And you can see that the essential question that they've identified for that very first part is the same as what we are going to be teaching in our unit on the American Revolution as well. What sparks a revolution? What causes a revolution? So that's when we were looking at the comparison of the two, there was a lot of alignment there. This is a snapshot of our standard 6.0, which is one of our largest standards for social studies. And if you take a look at this arc or this arrow that you see, the questions, disciplinary tools, evaluate sources, share conclusions is the exact process that we just talked through for what inquiry instruction looks like. So again, this is where we tried to decide which curriculum was more aligned, and Inquiry Journeys was the only one that really did that. Some of the other ones were more comprehension-based questions, and they were called compelling questions, but they were really just, here's the information and here's the right answer. So it's not really getting students to think critically or create their own questions. And that question formulation technique, again, is a perfect example of how students are creating their own questions. So this quote is one that I feel like just really shows the importance and the shift in social studies instruction since we have adopted the C3 framework and since Maryland has updated their frameworks. And one of the things that really sticks out to me is, I'm not sure if you guys would have seen this commercial or not, but there's a commercial that I've been seeing lately about this daughter who's sitting at the table and she's learning about Pompeii. And she asks her dad a question, and he asks Alexa the question, and Alexa answers it, and he tells her like he's a smart guy and knew all of the answers. So in an age of information where all of the information is literally a Google search away or a Siri search away, it's more important to not focus on memorizing the facts and more important to figure out how are we going to make sense of the overwhelming amount of information at our fingertips and become critical thinkers to interpret it. That's really the goal of social studies instruction and what that standard 6.0 is really all about. So with that, any questions that anybody has, you do have later in the attached documents for later in the board meeting, you do have a copy of the scope and sequence. So you can see a snapshot of all of the units and the questions that they have and their supporting questions. That's later in the attachments for the InquirED. Yep.
Granicus under it, yep.
So if you wanted to take a look at the scope and sequence and what questions the students would be asking and answering and what content is there, you do have a copy of that. Yeah, I know it's a lot to digest.
Well, the one thing that's important is we're more student-centered as opposed to teacher-centered, and I think anything we can do to get students engaged, and like, you know, just watching what Kathy Reagan did with the kids, I mean, that to me is such a learning tool. And when you all watch the video, you'll see, I mean, they're out in the garden, they're measuring, and they're planning, and they're taking care of, and then they write their letters, and I mean, it's pretty amazing. I think it's definitely a way to learn the content, but learn it in a way where they're also learning how to think.
Yeah, and that really is the goal, is that we're teaching kids how to think, not what to think. We want to make sure that we're teaching them how to think. One of the things that I think was also really great is that the open-ended inquiry might cause a lot of anxiety for teachers. So while we are supposed to be shifting to inquiry, we still do need a structure of some sort, and that's really what the curriculum provides us with. One of the teachers that I was talking to just the other day was talking about how excited she was about all of the Module 6s, which are the modules for taking informed action. And she said, I'm so excited to see what the kids come up with because I can see them writing letters to the principal about, you know, things they want to do to make change happen in the school, and they could just see the kids getting really engaged, particularly because it empowers kids to feel like they have a voice and a choice in what happens.
Is this being piloted in every classroom or just certain ones at this point?
It was every classroom, grades 3 through 5. So it was, yes, all classes, grades 3 through 5.
I have a child who came home and said that social studies was their favorite subject since returning to school. So
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
I can speak to this is going really well.
That's awesome to hear. We've heard a couple of those stories, and just the engagement factor is really there. And that was also a conversation that we had today, is that a lot of kids don't even realize they're doing social studies as they're doing this because it's just so much more engaging and they see the relevancy. I think that's one of the challenging things a lot of times with history classes is that sometimes people think, well, this happened 200 years ago. Why do I need to learn this? And this helps them to see how it's relevant.
Dr. Strang, question, because there's so much information now out in the web. How do you teach the children to differentiate between what is actual, factual, and what is not?
So there are lessons on media literacy that are part of teaching kids that process for how do I determine what is a reliable source, and how do I know that this is a place where I should be getting information and they've done their research. And there's a lot of different tests that, I say tests in the form of the thinking things that students need to do. When I come across a source, does it have this, this, and this? That's a process that has to be taught to students, and that's something that is expected when they're doing research.
And that's actually woven into all of our subjects, because it's important for them to think about that in every subject area. So if they're in science, we do that as well. If they're in, English language arts, whatever class they're in, they're doing that. And I tell you, the media specialists are really good at focusing in on that as well.
Great, thank you. Any other questions
you.
for Dr. Strang?